a company culture is always going to exist. There is no not having a company culture. The only question is what company culture are you going to have? It is the character and values of leaders that create company cultures. And so the character and values that leaders have are what drive the litany of decisions, the policies, the regulations, the expectations, the goals, and the mission of the company.
Welcome to KPI Fireside. Our mission is simple: to improve companies and to improve careers through continuous improvement. In every episode, we explore the spark, the moment, the mindset, or the method that ignites real change. Whether you're just starting out or leveling up, you'll find the insights and inspiration to fuel your next improvement. Welcome back to KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. I am your host, Keith Norris. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Stevens. Dr. Stevens is a distinguished presidential professor of leadership studies at Weber State University and a global expert on what makes organizations work. He's a founding partner of the Kozai Group and EQ Professionals, with leadership assessments used by over 400,000 people in 120 countries. For over 25 years, Michael has worked hands-on with leaders across business, government, and education, blending science and practice to build healthier cultures. He's also a creator of the pro-social leadership model, focused on turning values into real performance. And 15 years ago, I took a class as part of my MBA program from Dr. Stevens titled Leadership Through People Skills. And this one class was the best and most memorable class in my entire MBA program and was worth the price of admission. So I think my MBA program was probably $20,000 or $30,000. So another way of saying this is that the information that I hope to extract from Michael today is very valuable, and I hope that you're excited to join us over the next 60 minutes or so. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Stevens.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Keith. It's good to see you again. 15 years ago, so you were only 14 when you did your
Yeah,
MBA,
that's
is that
right.
right?
Yeah, I think maybe it was 14 years ago or something, but I think I started 15 years ago. But let me start with a little introduction. I like to refer to this as the spark. Tell us how you got started on this career path that you're in.
Good question. I guess if you had backed up when I was in middle school or high school, whenever the guidance counselors ask you what you wanted to be when you grow up, I never would have guessed this. So it's kind of those things where doors to your right open and doors to your left close, and you just kind of go through the ones that you're able. But I actually grew up internationally. My dad was doing expat work, and so by the time I got back to the U.S. to go to college, I had spent most of my formative years in Europe and South America, and so I had a real, kind of firsthand introduction to cross-cultural navigation and building bridges between people who have cultural differences. So I got to university and I did my undergraduate studies primarily in liberal arts, in philosophy and history. And then when I got out of that, I did the obvious thing that anyone with a philosophy degree would do and joined the Marine Corps as a commissioned officer. So I did that for a few years. And my dad, who was a CPA, in fact, at one point in his accounting career, he was president of the Utah CPA Association. So he's watching me go through all of these college and career machinations and kind of, I could tell he just wanted to know if I was ever going to get my act together and do something practical. And so after I got out of the Marine Corps, I finally realized, well, my dad might have been onto something. And so I got a job. My first civilian job after the Marine Corps was running a pizza restaurant for a national chain. And that was going nowhere real fast. So I figured maybe I'll get into the local MBA program. So I applied, I got admitted, started taking classes, and the very first class I took was this class called organizational behavior. And the professor always used to start each class by asking if any of us knew of organizations misbehaving, and we would address it that night in class. So, of course, he always said that tongue in cheek, but, the takeaway was there's no shortage of people and organizations who need this kind of insight. In short, though, one evening after class, it was a class I really enjoyed. I just lingered and chatted with him a bit and said, "So, how does somebody get a job like yours? It looks like it'd be a lot of fun." And he says, "Well, it is for me. For other people, it's not a good fit." But I said, "So, why did you do it?" And he said, "Well, when I was in college, I wanted to just stay in school and never have to get a job, so I became a professor." And I said, "I can do that." So I got into a PhD program. I took all the classes that they had. Then I wrote a dissertation on the social and interpersonal skills that employees need to be successful in a self-managed team environment. So that was kind of the nucleus where things started. And over the years, my thinking and my understanding and my exploration and my research have kind of rounded that out to where I started looking at the individual members of a team to try to figure out what kind of skills and competencies that they need. And after a few years of working both, in higher education and teaching my MBA classes, as well as working with companies in a consulting capacity, I realized you can improve the competencies of individual employees just like off the charts. But if you put them into a situation where leadership runs and manages them in an autocratic fashion, all of those good skills that your employees bring to the table are just going to be pushed off the table so that they're not really used by the organization. So then I started looking at, okay, so you got individual employees who are ready, willing, and able to contribute. But the problem is they don't because they are in an organizational structure where leadership is executed or deployed in a way that's counter to that. So that's when I got onto the question, well, how do you improve leadership skills? And I worked with a consulting company that came up with a program that you went through, Keith, and that I've been teaching in the business school, which is how to be mission focused and mission driven, but in a way that creates an organizational culture where your employees show up every day passionate, engaged, and ready to go above and beyond the call of duty. Not because they're ordered to, because you can't ever order anybody to be passionate. They do it because they want to. They do it because the company has a mission and a vision and something they're excited to contribute to. Of course, everybody gets paid, but a paycheck, it creates kind of a transactional mindset for employees. And so, if the message is constantly, "Hey, just shut up and do what I say because I give you a paycheck every other Friday," that's gonna create the kinda culture where employees kinda sink to the lowest possible expectation, and they're never gonna go above and beyond the call of duty.
Is there a model is there like a model that you can share with us, like that type of leadership is this, and there's a better type of leadership that's that?
Essentially, you can think in terms of 2 dimensions, right? So the horizontal from left to right is how respectful or disrespectful you are with your people as a leader. And the thing about that dimension is it doesn't matter what your intention is as a leader. What matters is how it lands on the people that you're leading, right? So, I will often when I'm teaching the class, the first night where we introduce the model and we've got the respect versus disrespect from left to right, and we got assertive versus passive from top to bottom. A lot of managers who don't recognize just how interpersonally aggressive they are, they think, well, I'm just after results. And if people are unhappy, that's just because they're snowflakes. That's not on me. I mean, okay, well, so you manage your people in a way where you don't intend respect, where if you were on the receiving end of your leadership, you wouldn't feel disrespected. But at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is trying to motivate people to engage with their heart and their minds, their souls to go above and beyond the call of duty. Your intentions don't dictate how they're going to feel about it. So what you've got to do is you got to be self-aware and you've got to develop some basic skills like listening, asking questions before interjecting your opinion or telling people what their marching orders are. Um, giving people the benefit of the doubt when they say something odd or weird or which you think is just bizarre and doesn't make sense. Developing a mindset of grace and a mindset of giving people the benefit of the doubt so that when you tell your employees what they want and they look at you and they say, well, that's really going to be a problem because of X, Y, and Z, instead of saying, no, you don't know what you're talking about, grant them a little bit of grace and ask them, well, okay, so what are you seeing? So one of the ideas that a student shared with me a number of years ago, she's actually a volunteer for an organization that trains dogs to be guide animals for the visually impaired. And so, just aside from being curious about her activities, one day in class, I forget exactly what we were talking about, but it was the idea that as leaders, you have to create space for employees to tell you that you're wrong because they see things that you don't. She raised her hand and she says, that's actually something that we work very hard to train our guide dogs to do. And I said, well, what do you mean? She says, yeah, we call it intelligent disobedience. I said, okay, so give me an example. She says, well, if you are a visually impaired handler, right, your dog is your seeing eye dog, and you walk up to an intersection and you hear the audible cue from the crosswalk that it's safe to cross, and you give the command to your dog to cross, but your dog can see that their car's coming. The dog needs to be trained to disobey their handler's order. That's called intelligent disobedience. And so I said, all right, so your analogy is you're telling me that the employee is the handler, or the employer, the boss, the leader is the handler, and the employees are dogs? She says, no, 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 no. I'm not suggesting that. She says, what I'm suggesting is that leaders are often blind and their eyes and ears are their employees. And unlike dogs who put the safety and well-being of their handler above any other consideration, I mean, that's really the distinction that makes it possible for these dogs to graduate and become, seeing eye dogs for their owners and their handlers. She said, what happens in business is our employees are often the eyes and the ears of the company. They see things that managers don't. And when a manager said, just shut up and do your job, employees will say, okay, you want to walk out in the street? Go ahead. I'm just going to stay back here and not get tagged. But that metaphor is a useful one because they're not only competencies and skills to being respectful, without losing control, there are also internal traits and predispositions that we bring to the table that our behavior builds on. So all of that's the one dimension from left to right that is how respectful versus disrespectful does your leadership approach land on the people you lead? And then the other is how assertive are you versus passive. And I know you probably got podcast listeners from all over the place, but here in Utah, it's a particularly big challenge because we have a culture of not wanting to have uncomfortable and awkward conversations, which include things like telling somebody that there are issues, concerns, problems, whatever performance things need to be addressed. It's just a lot easier to not say anything and then get rid of the person at the end of the year when their performance evaluation gives you the chance to do that. So, the challenge is, yes, how to be assertive, but also how to be respectful. And so one of the things I learned in the Marine Corps, through all the leadership training and experience I had, there's no question about being assertive. in that environment. Question is, how do you do it with respect? And this is an example, where respect like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So people who develop leadership styles from any of the branches of the military learned that direct, clear, and unambiguous communication is the ideal leadership approach, which is fine if the other people on the receiving end know and understand that that's just the culture and it's not a personal aggression. The challenge is for those leaders when they come out of the military and they have to now lead and manage civilians. They need to basically learn another language. They need to become fluent in another cultural skill set, which many of them do. But the um, the thing that's evolved, I guess, in the last 15 years or so, as I've been doing the classes, I've started to map out more and more the barriers that get in the way of well-intended managers who want to move into leadership, and they never really make that transition from manager to leader, right? I mean, the difference is managing is about processes and operations. Leading is about connecting and inspiring people. Any successful organization over the long run needs both of those things done. Not everybody in an executive capacity can pull off both of those. Some can do the managerial stuff really well and not so much the leadership. Others can do the leadership stuff really well, but they leave the managerial execution to other people in the organization, which is fine. But every successful organization has to have a balanced mix of both. So when it comes to the question of moving from management to leadership and pulling off leadership successfully, there are four barriers that I've written about in my research that get in the way. The first is knowing, second is doing, the third is feeling, and the fourth is being, right? So knowing, doing, feeling, being. The knowing part has to do with having a basic, simple mental model, like assertive versus passive and respectful versus disrespectful, right? That's the knowledge. The second part of knowledge, that's kind of the cognitive piece. The second part of knowledge is where are you as an individual on that map? Most managers that I've worked with over the years, and I've been doing this seminar for a couple of decades now. The biggest challenge I have in selling the program to leaders or managers in business is that when I talk about the program and I give them like my 10-second elevator pitch, where this leadership skills program, it's a training program where I take managers, equip them with the skills to inspire and lead their employees so that they show up every day uh, um, and want to go above and beyond the call of duty. And they do that by being inspirational and leveraging their people skills.
So it
Usually at
sounds
that point in the reaction, the conversation, the reaction I get from managers is, I've got to introduce you to my boss, or I've got to introduce you to someone else.
I think that's one thing that stands out to me is when like and I'm remembering back to this first day of class where you explained this model, and I remember my own impression was, "Oh, that sounds totally logical. I follow that 2 by 2 model. Sure, I'm always assertive, respectful."
And respectful, of course. I don't need
Yeah,
this, but
I
I know
got it.
lots of other people who need it.
Yeah,
In fact,
everybody else needs it.
yeah. So that's the cognitive piece that's related to your self-awareness, right? You have to know yourself well, and you have to know the model well. So, if you know the model, the model is really not that difficult. It's just two dimensions. How assertive versus passive are you, and how respectful and disrespectful are you? I mean, you can wrap your head around that in a couple of minutes.
Now you said something that I wanna ask you about because this I still remember a lot of this stuff from, from so many years ago. But you said something that I felt was a little bit like kinda, made me think like, "Is that true?" You said there's one right way to communicate.
Yes.
I don't know if this is me remembering something that didn't happen, but I remember, you making the case that there's one right way or one best way to communicate maybe?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What's that one best way to communicate?
And the answer to that is in a way that's respectful. The challenge is there's more than one way to be respectful, but the end goal is always to be respectful. So, with my former colleagues in the Marine Corps, The way I demonstrate respect is to get up in someone's face and yell at them and say, "You're gonna get us all killed if you do this." And when we're in a combat situation, right? That's respectful. And they all know that and they all understand that and they'll expect that. And it would be disrespectful if I weren't clear and direct, right? Because we just got a few seconds to make sure we're all on the same page. When I'm working with, the staff at the business school at Weber State, I got to change that up a little bit because they would not find that direct, unambiguous, in your face. You need to hear me because we only got 3 seconds to get this on the same page. They would find that hostile and disrespectful. So what I have to do is I have to change and adapt my interaction style so that whoever I'm working with feels validated, respected, and their worth and their dignity is honored.
This episode is brought to you by KPI Fire. Are you struggling to ignite real change in your continuous improvement program? Firestarter is your field guide. Real stories, proven strategies, no fluff. Get it now on Amazon. Now, one thing I found that was interesting, you said that as you were growing up, you lived in different places and you had experience in different cultures. You made a comment a minute ago about how in Utah we have this certain style. But I
Yeah,
think that's part of what you're getting at is, knowing how to communicate in one environment or in one company or with one group of people is great, but there's a lot of variation, and maybe some people don't figure out how to communicate outside of just that one style, that one company, that one environment where they grew up in.
that's right. That's right. So this is where those barriers come into play, right? So there's the knowing barrier, which is having a good model and being self-aware enough to appreciate the impact your current approach is having on other people, right? You gotta be socially aware. You gotta be interpersonally aware. And depending on the other person and kind of their background and the culture they're from and their expectations, some people learn to be very good at masking their true reactions. As a manager, I can evaluate, I can give clear and unambiguous marching orders, and everybody salutes, nods, and smiles. And I think, great, we're all on the same page. They feel validated, they feel respected, only to find out that I leave. And unless I'm there watching them and hovering, they don't get done because they're masking their reaction to what they feel is being treated disrespectfully. So there's that self-awareness skill. The second and third skills, or barriers rather, have to do with the doing and the feeling, which the doing is the basic mechanics of some, kind of real simple interpersonal skills. So, if Keith, you work for me and I want, a marketing campaign designed a certain way, and I've thought through it, I've worked out all the bugs, and I come to you as my employee to execute on this marketing plan. I tell you what I want. And then when I'm done, I say, "So, Keith, what are your ideas?" You're going to, in fact, you may even try a couple of times to interject, but if I talk over you, say, "No, no, no, let me tell you what I want first." At that point, you're gonna think, "Well, it's a done deal. Why even bother to share my thoughts or ideas?" And so I can go in to that same meeting with you and say, "Well, Keith, I wanna talk to you about a new marketing campaign. This is our goals. What are your thoughts on possible strategies that we might execute on to achieve that?" And then I listen. And you may come up with the very program that I walked in ready to tell you to implement. But if I sit and let you work through it, your ownership goes up, your commitment goes up, your buy-in goes up. And lo and behold, you know what, Keith, you might surprise me with some insight that never even occurred to me. You see something that I didn't, which is why I need to create that space for your insight, your creativity, your innovation, because as bosses and leaders and managers, we can't know everything. We can't see everything. And in fact, that's kind of like, why that it's up to the handler of those seeing eye dogs to create the space for that intelligent disobedience to be welcome. Because if the manager or the leader does not create space for that intelligence disobedience to be welcome, the employees just kind of sit down and shrug and say, whatever, they made their decision. So there's some basic interpersonal skills like asking questions rather than giving the answers first and then asking people what they think, because at that point, it's too late.
What are some of those questions that somebody should have at the ready for those kind of situations?
Most of them begin with what, why, tell me, and how. Okay. So I'm thinking of X. What are your thoughts? The first couple of times you try it as a leader, you might put your people back on edge if they're used to a version of you where in the past you've just come in and told people what to do. Part of that is also the third skill, which is the feeling, meaning, does it feel comfortable or awkward? And so, simple skills like asking questions before giving your views and asking open-ended questions to begin with what, why, how, and tell me. Most people are self-aware enough to appreciate and recognize when they're talking and asking questions versus when they're listening. So the challenge with that particular skill, which is one of the skills we practice quite a bit in that leadership through people skills class. We give you the skills and then we give you scenarios and put you in role plays where, you've got to have a conversation for 15 minutes in a role play with somebody else in the class who's being your subordinate in a meeting, for instance. Most of us know when we're talking versus when we're listening. We're self-aware enough, and most of us have the skill to be able to sequence those, ask first, respond later. The challenge is that most people in that training class don't do it because it feels too awkward and uncomfortable. You ask a question, you don't get the answer you want, so you change how you ask the question. Instead of, oh, well, tell me why you think that. We say, really? You want to do that? With a tone that suggests to the other person that you don't like what you're hearing, and they kinda, if they pick up on that tone, they withdraw, they slow down. But we often do it because it feels awkward and uncomfortable to ask a question and then sit there and wait patiently for that other person to maybe spin their wheels for a few minutes when you could, just in a matter of 10 seconds, tell them what the answer is that you want.
How would you describe that as a skill, like making space or being uncomfortable with a little bit of silence? What's the actual skill that we need to learn to be comfortable with that?
Well, it would fall under the general umbrella of emotional intelligence kind of skills, self-awareness, self-regulation, and empathy, right? And so empathy is one of the skills that I build more explicitly into the class now. I've kind of built as a process is what I call the benefit of the doubt skill. That's part skill, but also largely an emotional intelligence and self-regulation thing. So benefit of the doubt skill is when someone says something that to you sounds just bizarre and nonsensical. Benefit of the doubt skill is when that happens, the first step is recognize that you're hearing something that to you sounds bizarre and nonsensical. Step number two is acknowledge the fact that the other person wouldn't have said what they just said unless to them it made sense. And then step number three is to take upon yourself the mission of finding out why it made sense to them and what they're seeing that you don't. And when you frame things that way, it makes it easier for people to find the self-regulation they need to sit back and say, okay, why does my brother vote this way or
Mm.
think this way or have these views of political or social, whatever it might be. But it's the same thing with employees, right? When you ask an employee, what are their, and they give you just a bizarre answer. Well, there's a reason why that answer made sense to them. It only is bizarre to you. So, that it's part skill, but it's also part emotional self-regulation because, a lot of us, when we're in management positions, our model is that, hey, I'm in charge. I'm supposed to direct and I'm supposed to tell. And that is counterintuitive to somebody to say, no, no, no. Your real job as a leader is to listen and inspire and to bring people in so that their knowledge, their skills, their creativity, their passion has a place to flourish. But you're like, "No, I'm in charge. I'm the boss. I'm supposed to direct and tell." So I just go into the meeting, I direct people, I tell them what to do. End of story. It's and if they don't like it, then they can get a job somewhere else, but they just need to shut up and do what I tell them because I give them a paycheck every other Friday. That, for so many of us, is the default model that we all have when we go into, our careers.
So what would you say to a leader who's like, "Yeah, this all sounds great, this assertive, respectful thing, but I don't have time to wait for people to come up with the answers. It'll be faster for me just to tell them what to do from the beginning." Is it really
Yeah,
faster?
it'll be faster today. But what happens when you turn your back is you've created a culture full of people who do the bare minimum just to not get fired and just to not have you yell at them. So, that autocratic command and control, I'm in charge, I have to direct and tell, that will get you results as long as you are always there to look over people's shoulders and hound them. But you will never get them to move up what I call the motivation continuum, which is something I've developed over the years and I use more and more to answer that very question that you just asked. It's like, you know what? It's a lot easier for me to just tell people to shut up and do what I said because I know I'm right. But what happens is whenever you are leading in a situation where your followers have discretion over how they respond, that strategy is guaranteed to get you nothing more than the bare minimum of compliance. And that's on a really good day because that style of leadership is also far more likely to get you resistance where your people, if they feel like they've been insulted, disrespected, alienated, taken advantage of to the point where their sense of self respect and their sense of fairness and their sense of dignity is violated, they will go to all kinds of measures to even that score with you when you're
And that's
not
what you
looking.
would call that passive aggressive side of
Yeah.
the model, right? People can be
Yeah.
very devious when they're operating in that, passive aggressive form or in that
Yeah, and
communication
God
style.
help you if they're also very creative people, because there's no end to the mischief that they can create.
So one thing that's been shared a time or two on our podcast here that I have adopted as a belief is that the first day that anybody gets hired in any job, they're probably optimistic. They probably think this is going to be a great job. I'm going to do a wonderful I'm going to do wonderful work here. And then, 10, 20 years in, who knows how long it takes. At some point, somebody ends up in a different place on that communication scale. What are some of the things that if a leader has ended up in a situation where they've had some bad, some behavior that has created some of those environments, what are some things that they can do to because it probably doesn't change overnight, but what are some things that
Right.
they can do to start to move more to that assertive, respectful quadrant that you talk about?
Yeah. Well, it's a constant journey. There's always that gap between the ideal up here and where we are today, and you start to narrow that gap, through practice, through feedback, through self-reflection, having mentors or colleagues in the organization who understand the model, who understand the ideal, and can give you feedback on it. It's one of the reasons why I both appreciate, but I'm also highly suspicious of mentoring programs because you will get when you're receiving mentoring from somebody else, what you're receiving is mentoring and coaching that comes from their implicit leadership model. And most of us have an implicit leadership model. Says, well, look at me, I'm successful. I've been promoted. I've moved up in my career. Obviously, I do things right. Let me tell you what you need to do to be more like me. Now, nobody ever says it exactly like that, but that's the implicit thinking that they operate from. That's not to say then that mentors are not useful. I'm saying they can be, but they can also be very problematic. And one of the challenges we also have is who we see as our heroes that we aspire to be like. And so one of the things that we spend the very first day in class working on is having people sort out who they see as their heroes and what are the traits and values and the character of those people that make them heroes. Because if you tell me who your heroes are today, I'll tell you the person you'll become tomorrow. Okay. And so there's no shortage of overbearing, domineering, autocratic, interpersonally hostile people who run organizations where they chew employees up and spit them out in order to be successful. And they'll point to really rich and successful people and say, well, look at so and so. He runs his organization and he doesn't care about people's feelings. He just gets results. And how well has
So
he
on
done? Well, he's worth billions. All right. The question is not whether you can be successful while being an autocratic a-hole. The question is how much more successful would you have been had they not been an autocratic a-hole? And did they become successful because they're autocratic a-holes or despite their autocratic a-holery?
so on this topic, there's probably lots of people that we could discuss about their leadership style. Some of them I'll avoid, but one I want to talk about is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs often
Yes.
gets cited as one of these amazing creatives, but a lot of people also point to the fact that he was a very autocratic leader. He was, very, my way or the highway.
Yeah.
One time I had an opportunity to listen to Ed Catmull, who was Steve
Thank
Jobs'
you. Yes.
business partner at Pixar, and
Yes.
this is after Steve Jobs had passed away, but Steve Jobs has this, like, reputation for being a very autocratic type leader, and I think that it actually inspires a lot of people in tech to be that way, but Ed Catmull said something that I thought was incredible. He said, "Hey, a lot of people don't realize this about Steve Jobs, but in his later years and when he came back to Apple a second time, he was a completely different style of
Yeah.
leader." And there are some good videos of Steve Jobs out there about how he talks about how he learned to not just solve today's problem, but to think about the people that were working on the problem and work on the people rather than just cutting straight to the problem. So that was one example. I'm curious if there's some other ones that are approachable that we might
Yeah.
share.
Well, no, I love the fact that you brought up Steve Jobs and then used, Ed Catmull's perspective. Ed Catmull talks about this beautifully in the book that he wrote called Creativity Inc., and his, relationship with Steve Jobs. And Catmull's actually a Wasatch Front native, born and raised here, went to the University of Utah, got his computer science degree back in the 1960s. Always his career goal in life was to be an animator for the Disney company
Disney.
until he realized he couldn't draw for squat and found out that he could do things with computers. So he created Pixar. Steve Jobs was one of the early investors, but keep in mind that that was the Steve Jobs who had prior in his career been fired by the board of directors at Apple because he was an insufferable a-hole. Nobody recalls the Lisa computer that Steve Jobs led the project team on. It was an overpriced, overexpensive, unwanted computer, way too expensive for the market. But Steve Jobs told everybody who was saying this is not going to be a viable business product, he told them to just shut up and do what he was saying because he had this pure vision. And so, this was mid 1980s, ended up creating a personal computer that sold for about 11,000 bucks back then. I mean, that even back then in the early days of personal computers, they were, $2,000 to $3,000 for the top end. It was like it was insane. And he would not give up because he wouldn't listen to anybody. And for a variety of reasons like that, he got fired from the company he created because of his autocratic a-holery, right? So that's the Steve Jobs 1.0.
Yeah.
He got fired. He kind of wandered around in the wilderness, started Next Computer, had some success there. But along the way, he had some epiphanies that, hey, maybe what I want to do is important, but how I go about doing it with people on whom I depend is just as critical. And so he got into the ground floor with Ed Catmull at Pixar Animation and became the Steve Jobs 2.0 that most of us associate with the success that he had. But the old Steve Jobs 1.0 is the one that most of us think of or recall seeing depicted in movies or films or
Yeah.
TV shows.
So I guess what we're getting at is even if you've been an insufferable a-hole as a leader, there's hope that you can change.
Yes. Absolutely. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if there weren't hope, okay? But the hope is the kind of hope that alcoholics have when they realize they need the AA program, right? I mean, I mentioned earlier that the most typical response I get from autocratic managers who need this work to grow and develop their people skills is that I don't need it, but I know all these other people who need it. It's like, I've often described the selling challenge that I have with this program is like trying to sell an alcoholic on an AA program who doesn't think he has an alcohol problem, right? So it's
Yeah.
not until they get to that point where they realize maybe the reason I have employees with all these passive aggressive attitudes where they won't cooperate, where they resist, they dig in their heels, they just do the bare minimum. They're always looking to quit and go somewhere else. Maybe the reason I have that kind of people in my company is because of the culture I've created as a leader. And then they're gonna be open and willing and ready to do the work.
So this idea of, getting somebody to be interested in this content, even if it's just somebody who was like, "Man, this podcast is good. I'm gonna share this with my direct reports." If I have direct reports and I say, "Hey, I need you to listen to this podcast," no, they might do it. But if I have a boss and I'm like trying to manage up or manage my manager, again, our power is a little bit different up than it is down sometimes.
Yes.
What's your advice for what can somebody do who wants to um, share that up, I guess. What are your
Yeah.
options?
Well, I'd say, think of it in 2 ways. First of all, think of creating this kind of collaborative culture where you have influence. That is, make sure even if you are in a company that has a very autocratic, maybe even interpersonally hostile, "We don't care about you, we just care about the results you deliver for us," and that's your overarching company culture. You as an individual manager or leader, you can create a little microculture of your own where people flourish, where they come to work. They love working for you. They enjoy what they do. You help give them purpose and meaning, respect. You give them space for their creativity and their innovative capacity to flourish. So it may be difficult for you to change up, but you can always change down. So start where you are and create an environment where the people who report to you can experience the kind of leadership we've been talking about. When it comes to managing up, yes, it is true that you don't have the same kind of power over a manager the way your manager has over you, but there are two kinds of power in the world. There's power over and there's power with. And so when it comes to your boss who's an autocratic a-hole, first of all, recognize it and then realize that many of these skills we're talking about can be deployed upward. And the key is to frame things within the context of what it is your manager wants from you. And that if you have opportunities to work with your manager and emphasize the benefit that will come to them and make them look good and increase their metrics, whatever those KPIs might be, you need to take more of an initiative in working with them and rather than cowering, say, I don't want to go talk to my boss today because he's in a bad mood. Instead, say, okay, my boss is in a bad mood. But if I go to my boss and say, hey, boss, I figured out to save us $100,000 next quarter, let me know if you're interested. I'll share with you what I've been thinking. And at that point, what's your boss going to say?
Yeah. You said something a few minutes ago about, I forget exactly how you referenced it, but it was like, before you go and share your opinions, ask some questions. And I think what you just did right there was an example of before you go and tell your autocratic a-hole boss that that's what they are, you go in with some questions. Hey, I have some ideas about how we could make more money, how you could, get all these things that you say you want. Explain that it sounds like there's like a technique or something in there.
Yeah, it's what I call the what's in it for the other person technique. It's anybody who's been in sales has probably heard this, but I mean, managing and leading is in a lot of ways a basic sales function. Now, people who actually are in sales for a living would understand this because you don't have power over your clients to demand or order them to buy from you. What you have to do is you have to influence and you have to sell. Best way to sell something is counterintuitive and very unnatural for most of us because it requires empathy. Meaning, the best salespeople are not the ones who go into a sales opportunity thinking in terms of what do I need? I need the sales, I need the commission, I need the numbers, I need the metrics, I've got my quotas. I've got to get these numbers so I'm in line for the next promotion or the next career move. Me, I need, buy for me. Those are the least effective salespeople, but they constitute about 95% of all the people who are in sales because it's the default for like 95% of us as human beings. The few who are really, really good at sales are the same people who would be really good at leading because they understand that it's about influence and figuring out how is my product or service or my proposal going to make this other person's life better when they look at it through the lens of what matters to them. That's the WIF top, WIIFTOP. What's in it for the other person? So the more you listen up front as a salesperson, the more you understand what your potential client or your lead needs, what they want, what their worries are, what their problems are, what their concerns are, what the solutions are they need, the more you understand that, the easier it is for you to go, oh, we got a product, we got a service that does A, B, C, and D. You mentioned three of those are problems. Would you like to see what that package looks like? And it's the same thing with a boss, right? Your boss really, if you think of it that way, is that client that you're trying to sell a proposal on. You just have to convince them that it's best, but you don't convince them by beating them with data and facts and information. You convince them by listening, finding out what their worries are, what their concerns are, what their fears are, and then positioning your proposal as boss. If you greenlight this project, we can accomplish A, B, and C, which are going to increase our throughput, our productivity. It's going to lower our operating costs. What do you think?
And I think this idea of selling ideas, selling projects, selling upward is a key part of what we do every day in our day job here at KPI Fire is working with ideas that come from close to the shop floor, you might say, and then figuring out how to communicate those in a way that are gonna matter because the things that the leaders and the senior executives care about might be phrased differently, like they might
Yeah.
be worded differently, and I think that's where you're getting at with this idea of respect is if you understand what they want, there's a good chance that the things that you want and the things that they want, you might be speaking about them differently, but it's a good idea when those things can overlap.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to influence people to buy into your pitch or your proposal or your project if you can package it in a way where they see the value through the lens of what matters to them.
Yeah, there's probably like a mindset difference here. I know some people feel like salespeople are inherently like tricksters and trying to get them to do things that they shouldn't do. I have a different mindset. I feel like sales is a great profession because you're helping people solve problems, and you should never try to sell somebody something that they don't need. But helping somebody solve a problem that they have is a great thing to do. Like we all
In
love to
in
have solutions.
fact in fact, the people who make for good drama in Hollywood TV and, shows and movies fit that stereotype of the used car salesman huckster who's gonna talk you into something you don't want. You can do that once, maybe, if you're lucky. Most of the time, you will never get a relationship, an ongoing business or professional relationship with that person. They'll never come back and buy another car from you if they realize that's what happened. But the best kind of salespeople don't make good drama because when you've had the conversation to find out what your client or the person you're trying to help really needs, and you say, "Oh, well, we got products and services that accomplish three of those four things that you mentioned. You know what happens next? You don't even have to ask for the business. Say, that's amazing. How soon can you deliver?" is what the customer will say. Those are the people who are really good at sales.
That's so true. I want to come back to this model again a little bit. The assertive part means, saying what needs to be said, I guess is kind of my summary. The respectful part, I find sometimes that respect is one of these things that can be misinterpreted. Like somebody might say, "Well, is respect just being nice to people?" How would you
Yeah.
describe what respect really is?
Well, no, it's important not to conflate kindness with respect.
What's the difference?
Yeah, so kindness is when you don't say something because it might hurt the other person's feelings, okay? But sometimes you need to deliver a message that's gonna sting no matter how you deliver it. And if the message that you need to deliver is gonna save the person or help them move off of a failing trajectory that they're on, and onto something more constructive, right? So, like, for example, an employee who, has been underperforming and telling them more, specifically why they've been underperforming, and giving them a chance to correct it, it's gonna sting a lot of employees when you tell them that their current performance is below standard. So you don't tell them because you don't wanna hurt their feelings, and then 6 months from now, you have to fire them because it's too late. And they're like, "6 months ago, you could have told me and I could have fixed whatever the issue is, and now you're firing me? Why didn't you tell me 6 months ago when I could have fixed it, when I could have changed, when I could have improved, when I could have addressed it?" "Well, I didn't wanna hurt your feelings." How disrespectful is that, right?
Yeah.
You don't tell me the truth because you don't wanna hurt my feelings, but now I'm getting fired because you didn't wanna hurt my feelings 6 months ago. It's like, no. Now there's a way to deliver a message that's gonna sting without being hostile about it, right? So, for example, Keith, if you're my employee and you've been performing below standard, I sit down and say, let's have a coaching session. Let's have an informal performance review session. My first question or my first part of the conversation with you is a question. It's not a statement that you've been below standard. My first question is, Keith, tell me what you understand the expectations to be. And I just sit back and I listen.
Yeah,
And you
so and
walk
then
me
my
through that
answer
expectation.
in some companies might be, "I don't really know because there isn't a standard that exists."
Who is that, and who do you put the blame on for that? The employee?
I would say that's the leader where you've gotta define
Exactly.
what the standard is. You have to have a standard if you expect someone to meet the standard.
Yeah, these are your KPIs, right? I mean,
Yeah, your
KPI
targets.
these are what I expect from you. Not only what I expect from you, these are my expectations about how you do it, right?
Yeah, standard
Don't
work.
do it in a way where you alienate people. Don't do it in a way where you beat up your colleagues, your coworkers, your team members, this is what I expect from you, and this is how I expect you to achieve it, right? So my conversation with a substandard employee is like, "Okay, Keith, tell me what you understand your expectations to be." And I sit back and wait. And you walk through them. And you maybe hit the 2 or 3 highlights, but maybe there are 3 or 4 that you don't mention that I've not really communicated with you. And so in this first step, I ask you, "Okay, what about this? What about this? What about this?" And I get your response where you might say, "Oh, who cares about that? Oh, you've mentioned that in the past, but it's not really that important." But I'm taking notes. I'm not stopping you and correcting you and saying, "No, you're wrong." I'm asking you to paint this picture for me. What do you understand the expectations for your role to be? And then the second part is, okay, let's walk through. Tell me what grade you would give yourself on each of those, A, B, C, or D. And then I take notes. Then you're done. And then it's my turn now to give you my performance evaluation. Even though I need to communicate, no, Keith, I agree with you that you're above average on this and this. I've actually would give you higher marks than you gave yourself on these other two. But on the fourth and fifth elements here that you mentioned, the timeliness, the responsiveness, the attention to quality, whatever the metrics are. It's a I would give you below average ratings, and here are some examples. And then the question is, so Keith, given this feedback, where do you want to go with it? Now, that feedback that I've identified where you're below average, for a lot of people, that's going to sting. But am I doing this in a way that you feel disrespected? My guess is probably not. Okay. Not everybody is robust, but 99% of people are going to be open and much more willing to hear that feedback, even though it stings, because it's going to give them a chance to get onto that trajectory where they want to with their careers. That's why it's respectful. It's not that it's soft pedaling, and it's not that I'm not going to tell you things that might hurt or sting, but this is my elaborated description of the researcher and author Brene Brown, who has a famous quote I love to use in class, where she says, "Clear is kind," right? Clear is kind. But I would also say that the way I would modify her quote is I'd say, "Clear is kind, comma, even if it stings." Okay. But what makes it respectful is, are you doing it in a way where the other person knows and appreciates and understands that this is coming from a place of, I want you to be successful. I want to hear your thoughts, and I want to work with you to get you on the trajectory that is going to be best for you in your future. Notice how in all of that, I'm focusing on you, Keith, and what is in it for you, not what I want from you so I look good as your manager.
Yeah, the one thing about that I really like is rather than coming in and saying, "Hey, we need to have a discussion about your performance," you came in and said, "Hey, let's have a conversation about performance. How do you think you're doing against the standard?" And put it back on me to explain. First of all, do I know what's expected of me? Because if I don't have an answer to that question, that's a pretty good starting place.
Yeah.
Gives gives you a chance to respond to those things that might be missing there. I think
And
that's
then ask you to evaluate yourself, because a lot of times, yeah, a lot of managers would rather get a root canal to do their annual employee performance evaluations. And the reason is because they got to go in and give a grade. Well, reverse that so that you give the grade at the end after the other person's talked about what they understand the expectations to be, and they've given themselves a grade. Because a lot of times you'll find that people are harder on themselves than you would be as their manager, which means that instead of being the bad guy and going in and saying, of all the things you have to do, I'm going to focus on these two areas where you're below standard. Let's talk about the whole picture. Let's talk about what you do well. And in fact, when you grade yourself on certain things where you're too harsh, I can come in and say, well, you gave yourself a B minus. I give you a solid B plus or maybe an A minus. On these other ones, though, let's talk about where there's room for growth and improvement.
This next comment will probably say more about me as a leader than maybe I wanna, expose, but your comment about the best people usually underrate themselves, I have like a model mental picture of this. I think the best people that I've had where I've done performance reviews tend to underrate themselves. The worst people tend to overrate themselves. So I
Have
don't know
you ever
how
heard of something that's called the Dunning-Kruger effect?
I've heard the term, but I don't recall
Yeah,
what it
it's the idea that foolish or incompetent people are too foolish or incompetent to understand just how foolish and incompetent they are.
there you go, precisely.
That's especially true with interpersonal skills.
Yeah.
I've done lots of research over the years and done peer ratings, manager ratings, and self ratings of interpersonal skills to look at ways to validate instruments I develop. And there is actually a small but negative correlation in the interpersonal skills that people actually have and how they rate themselves. It's the interpersonal bore who has no idea how they come across when we ask them, so how would you rate your people skills? Like, I'm great. I don't care. People say what they say. I do fine. And it's the ones who are more attentive and more attuned and more sensitive to the impact of their behavior on other people that go, I could always be a little bit better. Those are the ones who are actually rated higher by their peers and their bosses. They're a little bit harder on themselves because they have more self-awareness and higher expectations. But The, uh, uh, the most people, when you're talking about the middle of the bell curve, most people tend to be self-aware enough to realize that they do have areas for growth and improvement, which means they're aware that, at least according to their own standards, they could improve. And if you start with the conversations where, you're working with your subordinates and you begin from that premise, it's easier when your mindset is to give them the benefit of the doubt and then work forward from there. And so of the three barriers that I mentioned right at the beginning of our podcast, there's the knowing, which is having good mental models and having good self awareness. There's the doing, which is actually practicing on developing executable skills. The third is the feeling, which is how does it feel? Where are you in terms of your emotional intelligence? The fourth actually has to do with character and values. And I've actually got more into this the last maybe 6 or 7 years and have developed a follow-on class to the one you took in our MBA program, which I call Leadership Through Character, because it is the character and values of leaders that create company cultures. And so the character and values that leaders have are what drive the litany of decisions, the policies, the regulations, the expectations, the goals and the mission of the company. Those all flow from the character and values of leaders. And so a company culture is always going to exist. There is no not having a company culture. The only question is what company culture are you going to have? And the vast majority of businesses have company cultures by default that simply reflect the character and values of whoever's in charge and got to make all the decisions and create rules and policies and procedures that are the lived company culture of the employees, right? So you end up with autocratic command and control cultures where everything is driven by serving only one of our stakeholders, which is shareholders, and maximizing shareholder profits. And what you end up with is a company where employees are viewed as an expense. The only way you can maximize profits is minimizing expenses while increasing revenue. So if you're a leader who makes decisions and creates policies and regulations and sets goals and objectives and expectations based on that, you're going to have a company culture where people are going to regress to the lowest possible denominator, which is do the bare minimum. Because if I'm an employee in the company and my boss comes and says, work harder, work smarter, work faster, be more efficient, do more with less, and I'm looking at this and I go, okay, if I do all that, I go home more tired at the end of the day. I go home with the same paycheck at the end of the month. And my boss and all the shareholders are richer and more successful. You know what? I'll just do the bare minimum. People don't actually explicitly make that statement, but that's what's going on in their heads.
I do want to ask you a couple of just rapid fire questions. These are just kind of short questions and just, kind of short word phrase, sentence kind of answer. The most important job of a leader is to blank.
Inspire people to go above and beyond.
Do you have a favorite question?
My favorite question, it's a variation of why, what, and tell me.
What is something about leadership that you tend to believe that others might disbelieve?
It would be that leadership, when it works best, is both plumbing and poetry.
Plumbing.
What I mean
Leader
what I mean by that is the plumbing part is that you gotta execute, you gotta get things done, the pipes gotta work, and you need to minimize the leaks. The poetry part is what inspires the human beings that you bring into your organization and on whom you depend to make the plumbing work.
leadership is plumbing and poetry. That's a great one. I love that one.
I stole that from Brené Brown, just to be clear.
Right. I like that one. Okay, one question. AI is something that everybody's talking about. What are your thoughts on how this leadership skill changes in the future of AI? Everybody's worried about jobs. What are your thoughts on the future of leadership and AI?
Yeah. Well, the leadership, when it's done well, when it's the poetry part, is all about the human connection. And AI can do so much, but the best leaders are the ones who have figured out what the human element and the human component of leadership is. Not the management side, although that's absolutely essential. The management's more like the plumbing, and the human side is the poetry. At the end of the day, my take on business and the role of AI is that we start with a fundamental assumption that business is a social enterprise whereby people engage in commerce with other people. And so, to the degree that we can leverage AI to help us do that, it makes sense. But we're all part of a large, interdependent, interconnected, very complex world. And the degree to which AI helps us all engage with one another is going to serve us best. When it starts replacing people to the point where they're no longer see themselves as having a role in our complex and interdependent societies, then I think we've got to take a step.
All right. Do you have any book that you recommend or multiple books that you would recommend for others?
Yeah, actually, quite a few. I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek's book, The Leaders Eat Last. He talks about a lot of these ideas, gives lots of wonderful stories. Brene Brown has got two books that I would put at the top of the list. One just came out this past year called Strong Ground, which is a follow-on to a book that she wrote called Dare to Lead a couple of years ago. So both of those together are really good ones. There's a third book, or a fourth book rather, that I would add to the list, but it is very dense and kind of hard to work through. But it's probably the single most important book on human motivation that has been written in the last 75 years, and it's resoundingly ignored by almost everyone, including professors. And that book is called Punished by Rewards by Alfie Cohen, Kohn. And then the last book that I would mention is from a psychologist named Martin Seligman called Flourish. And it gives lots of really great ideas. It has to do with defining and mapping out how we move from just being healthy to flourishing and well-being. And there are a lot of insights for leadership that managers can take away from that go above and beyond looking at employees who you just give paychecks to in exchange for labor. People look for meaning and flourishing and well-being, and the degree to which you can create an environment where people experience that in your business is the degree to which you can create an environment where people are excited to come to work every Monday instead of excited when it's over on Friday.
Yeah, I love that, and that's one thing I enjoy about what we do, and a lot of the folks that I get to interact with is I do work with a lot of people who really like what they do for work. I mean, I'm sure they'd all find something different if it didn't pay, but the fact that they get to do this stuff and get paid for it, I think is a great thing. Uh, and it sounds like there's a couple of books there that I should definitely go check out.
Okay.
Well, Dr. Stevens, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I look forward to having you back sometime in the next couple of, in the future. And we really appreciate your time and your experience.
My privilege, Keith. Thanks for the invitation.
You bet. You bet. For our listeners, if you'd like to suggest a guest or ask a question, give us any ideas for future episodes, please reach out. You can drop a comment. You can find me on LinkedIn also, Keith Norris on LinkedIn. And this concludes this episode of KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. If you've enjoyed the episode today, be sure to add a comment, like, follow, subscribe, depending on the platform that you're on, and share the podcast with your friends or colleagues who are as passionate about continuous improvement as you are. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. And until next time, keep driving progress and sparking change.